Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining the American Muslim Advisory Council. Today we have Dr. Steve Sharp, the Medical Director for Clinical Research Associates, with us today to talk more about clinical vaccine trials. Dr. Sharp serves as a principal investigator for the Clinical Research Associates clinical trials. He's triple board certified in internal medicine, endocrinology, and hypertension, and has more than 2 decades of experience conducting clinical research studies, and has been featured on NPR Marketplace for his work to connect underserved communities with opportunities to participate in research. Always ready to connect with patients, Dr. Sharp has a natural ability to describe complex medical issues in a way that non-medical professionals can understand. Thank you so much, Dr. Sharp, for being with us tonight on Zoom. I know last week we were going to have the program, but yeah, even at home, Zoom, the snow closed us in. I guess we got some days off, but yes, I'm eager to learn more about clinical trials, especially with the COVID vaccine. But I first wanted to ask you, what made you interested in doing work with clinical trials?
Well, thanks for having me. I'm not really sure what motivated me. It was an interest that predated my going to medical school even. I designed and ran my first clinical trial when I was in college.
Oh, wow. Wow. And
yeah, I got 20 of my, well, actually 19 of my classmates and one faculty to take a urine sample, blood pressure, and pulse before and after 10 minutes of video game playing.
Well, that's fascinating because, you know, we read about a lot of research, but we don't really look in the details about how those research is conducted, but we benefit from it, obviously. So I wanted to just start out with just a basic question. What is a clinical trial?
Well, a clinical trial is really any research project that involves humans as subjects. So you can break scientific studies down into a few different categories. The laboratory stuff, whether it's cell culture or chemistry or whatever, would be called bench research. And a lot of times that's where you get at molecular issues or cellular issues. And then, of course, if you've got, say, a drug compound or a vaccine that looks promising, you want to characterize it chemically first. Then you move on to the animal studies. The bench and animal studies together are called preclinical trials, with, of course, the notion that all of this is leading to investigating something in humans. We still have to use animals to a certain extent for safety purposes, really. For anything to get to human testing, whether it's a drug or a vaccine, and in many cases a device, you will usually have it exposed to at least 3 different species of animals. And if it doesn't clear those hurdles, then you're not going to try it on a human. Once you get to the human trials, we have 4 different phases. Phase 1 is very short, very basic. You'll give a dose to a person. You might try 10 different doses to see which one you want to proceed with. Then you'll do the dose repeated in a person. Say it's a once-a-day drug. Well, let's give it once a day for a week and see, does it build up in the bloodstream? Do you really want to give it that way? It's still more than anything about safety. Is this a tolerated thing? So you do a lot of, you'll usually have this person in an inpatient type setting and be drawing blood on them maybe around the clock to measure blood levels and liver functions and that kind of thing. Once you decide that it's sufficiently tested to move on to phase 2 is still mostly about safety, but that's where you start to look at how will this thing perform in more of a real world setting. It's really a jumping off point for designing the phase 3 study, which is more the real life study. So you'll decide on 1 or 2 different doses to go forward if it's a drug. In this case, with the COVID vaccine, they actually had in the Pfizer study 3 different candidates, and it wasn't until the phase 2 that they decided which candidate to move forward into the phase 3 studies. But the main thing in phase 2 is how should we design a study around this product?
Mhm.
And then in phase 3, that's where you really give it to folks in real life and basically thousands of people. Phase 1 would be dozens of people. Phase 2 might be hundreds of people. Phase 3 is thousands of people. And from that, you have enough people involved that you can get a statistical bearing on how effective is the product. So you're really not sure if something will work or not until you get to phase 3.
Wow.
Then anything that comes after being approved, something that's, gone through the FDA, met the mark for safety and efficacy, it's going to be on the market. Then phase 4 is whatever comes after. Do we want to do a comparison of this drug to another drug? Which blood pressure drug is the best, for instance? That would be phase 4. Post-marketing study would be called. So that's kind of the lay of the land for clinical trials.
Well, so what I got from that is, so human beings aren't the first guinea pigs. It's the medicine or whatever is the trial drug is first experimented with animals. So just
That's right.
the level of safety, right?
And you end up with a dictionary level of information just from the animal studies.
Mm-hmm.
They, will have data on reproduction, on whether you have any problems with the genes, stuff that it's not easy to do. We don't do pregnancy studies in humans, but they'll do pregnancy studies in mice and rabbits, for instance, to see whether it affects their babies.
So I have so many questions, but right now we have the Pfizer vaccine, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson is almost ready to be rolled out. Why are you still looking at vaccines for COVID? Because aren't these enough? Or do we really need more, or should we just be focused on getting people vaccinated right now?
Well, there's a couple of reasons for it. One is there's no one drug manufacturer that can make enough vaccine for the world. I think we've watched in real time how difficult it's been for Pfizer and Moderna to gear up production sufficiently just for one country, even though they are shipping to other countries, of course. Now, part of that is with those two, they're using a totally new technology. Well, it's not totally new. They'd already made vaccines against the original SARS and MERS, but those were, of course, just in the phase 2 studies by the time those diseases kind of fizzled out.
Mm-hmm.
So they didn't make it into the big trials, and they certainly didn't make it onto the market. So this is the first time they got an RNA vaccine into phase 3 testing, and I'd be amazed if they don't make it fully approved, because at least for the combination of Moderna and Pfizer with the emergency use authorization, we've got something on the order of 45 million people in this country who've already gotten those vaccines, and of course in other countries too, and nothing really bad is showing up. So it would be surprising if they didn't get full approval. But even so,
go ahead.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, even so, we're going to need enough vaccine for 8 billion people, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And these guys are struggling to make tens of millions of doses.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing is, we've got the reality of viruses is they mutate. They keep changing. There's a reason we have to have new flu vaccines every year.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we don't just have one brand of flu vaccine. There's almost a dozen. So to make enough, and it's a business. You have somebody who can produce a product. They're going to compete with other producers of products. We don't just have Ford. There's GM and Chrysler and Toyota and all the other brands. So everybody who thinks they can make a good version is going to try to do so and compete for the money that's involved.
Yeah. So you mentioned the new variants of COVID, and I just saw in the news today where I believe it was either Pfizer or Moderna was trying to look at booster shots or something to make it more effective to the new variants. And so will the vaccines that are still under trial have a leg up, say, in being effective towards those new variants?
It's going to vary from one to the next. The data on both Moderna and Pfizer vaccines still look pretty darn good against the South African variant, but both companies are already in the process of coming up with a version 2.0 that should be even more effective, and they're hoping to make it equally effective to the old virus as to the new variant. Of course, by the time they've got that out, there'll probably be a third and a fourth variant to worry about. It's definitely a moving target.
Right.
And I figure it'll be sort of like the flu vaccine in that we'll be chasing the mutations as they come along. And so we may every year or two have to have a new version of the vaccine.
Yeah. Wow. The idea that every year or two we have to go through this whole vaccination process, it's been daunting, but I wanted to know, because I'm trying to think of people out there like they're waiting to get a vaccine, but there are trials going on, and so they're questioning like why would I join a trial? Like, am I just unnecessarily putting myself at risk? And how safe are these trials? If I wait, maybe if you're younger, you have no underlying health conditions, it may be a long time before you get a vaccine. But how safe is it to jump into a trial?
Well, I think it's reasonably safe. I mean, one of the reasons doctors are required to be involved at every research site. So my place of work is called a research site. And these are all independent of the drug companies, so that there's no direct benefit to me. I don't get paid if the drug makes it and don't get paid if it doesn't. So there's no bias in that regard. And that was the whole idea. If it's the drug company do it, they have an implicit bias to get a product on the market. I get to be a neutral kind of a referee type position. If it's not good, I'll say it doesn't look good. If it causes, people to sprain their ankles, okay, I'm going to report every sprained ankle. And then on the flip side, if it doesn't seem to cause many problems and seems to do the job well, then maybe it should be on the market. But that's always going to be under the direct supervision of a doctor, or in the case of some studies, a dentist. Because our job is still to look after the welfare of the people in the studies. And I can tell you my own history. It's been a long time, but better than 10 years ago, there was a study we were conducting for a new blood pressure drug. And I was blinded. I didn't know who was on drug and who was on placebo. But it was very clear that half the folks in our study were having serious problems.
Wow.
And I stopped the study at our site, which was not appreciated by the drug company at all. They were furious. In fact, we didn't get business from them for a good 10 years. So they held a grudge. But subsequently, I'm proud to say I guessed right, because the drug did not make it through the FDA. The safety factors were problematic, to say the least. And so I pulled the plug before anybody got hurt. Yeah. And that's the job of any physician who's conducting trials. It may be one person, for instance, who has a problem and nobody else does. Well, then you stop that person's participation, because the welfare of that person is more important than getting the data on the drug. And that is sacrosanct in this line of work.
Well, that's good.
So that's one reason.
Yeah, because I think that's one of the concerns people have is, if I have adverse side effects, are they going to keep me on the study? And I know back in November they had a pause in the Pfizer study trial because there were some adverse reactions, and then they restarted it. So,
Well, that was the AstraZeneca.
okay, that was AstraZeneca. Okay, yeah. So is that common? You know.
So you will get that. Consider when you're looking at tens of thousands of people,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to have real life happen. There's going to be car wrecks.
Mm-hmm.
If it's the right age group, you're going to see heart attacks. You're going to see illnesses happen. Then the question is there a trend?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're having, say, 10 heart attacks and they're all on the drug or the vaccine and none on placebo, that's a pretty worrisome trend.
Yeah.
All of these studies also above the site level will have a safety monitoring board, again, of independent physicians who are looking at the data. So they'll see data from all the sites, not just from one.
Yeah.
And they'll be able to pick up on a rise in events, whether it's a rise in liver function tests or kidney function or whatever, blood pressure. And if that's an issue, then a study gets halted until that can be sorted out.
Mm-hmm.
If there seems to be some other thing going on that isn't the drug, then it gets restarted. Now, in the case of the AstraZeneca halt, they had one case
Mm-hmm.
of what's called transverse myelitis, but that's a very worrisome condition. It can be paralyzing. Well, they looked at that. They found there was one case. Of course, you can't make a trend out of one. They saw nobody else who was exposed to that vaccine who was having any similar type problems. At the same time, studies on that vaccine were going on in many countries around the world. So the UK restarted their studies fairly promptly. In the US, we had 3 different government organizations looking into it. The FDA and the CDC were doing it, but also the National Institute of Health was looking into it because they had some research sites doing that study. They went a step further. They looked at the data from the MERS and the SARS vaccines, which were
Mm-hmm.
basically AstraZeneca vaccines using the same, let's say, recipe, what they call it a platform, the same platform for their vaccine. And they found no data from any of those studies either. So they gave the green light to restart. But because they dug into all those other studies, it took them a full 2 months before, in the U.S., AstraZeneca get started again.
But
and we've seen no similar cases since.
Yeah, you feel like they're doing the due diligence and making sure it's safe. So that is that is good to know. You know, one question I had is like, what is the average time a trial takes? I mean, obviously, you get different medicines that are under clinical trials, but I mean, some people are questioning, well, this COVID vaccines it has a very quick turnover, like within 9 months, they had the vaccine out. And so people are like, how can that be? Is that safe? And what are you seeing for COVID vaccines? Like, you know, why are they able to make them so quickly?
Yeah, that's true. It came out pretty fast because they had 20 years of work going into being able to make them this fast, which the public out there hasn't watched, but we've watched it evolve for 2 decades now. And that actually comes from governmental fear of the possibility of bioterrorism. They said, well, what if somebody released something in the US? How fast could we make either vaccine for something we already have the recipe for, like, say, anthrax? Can we gear up production? And what if it's a new agent? How fast can we develop a new vaccine? So a lot of work has gone into being able to do this. And like I said, the AstraZeneca vaccine was based on previous work with SARS and MERS. Even though it's new in that COVID is new, the process wasn't new. And they had refined this to the point that they do what's called a plug and play. So the platform is kind of just a generic vaccine formula. And then you decide with a new agent. So for COVID, the target is the spike protein, that little thing that sticks out on the top of the surface of the cell to make it look like a crown. That turns out to be the part of the virus that our immune system best recognizes as foreign and makes antibodies against. So the first thing you do is you try to find out what's the target that the immune system wants to recognize. Then the old way of doing it is you take literally that target, you grow up virus, used to be in chicken eggs, and then you essentially break it up chemically and take the protein part or whatever part you want, and you pack that into solution and you inject it. So you've got foreign protein, not whole virus, but part of the virus, and the human body will then make antibodies against it. What's changed with this is they take the RNA, just the stretch that codes for the spike protein, and you put that in, and it's got to be in some kind of a delivery system that will get it into a cell. If you inject RNA into the bloodstream, you'll just break it down. It won't do anything. But if you get it into a human cell, then it tells what's called the ribosome of the cell to make the protein it codes for. The idea being you can get the human cells to crank out a lot more spike protein than you can put into a single injection. And therefore, that ought to get a better immune reaction than you would get from the standard old-fashioned protein vaccine. So what we're looking at now, we've got Pfizer and Moderna that are doing the RNA thing, and they, with the original COVID, shown better than 90% effectiveness. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is using spike protein, and it's got about a 70-75% effectiveness. So we are seeing an indication that maybe the idea is holding water. Maybe the RNA approach does work a little bit better.
So since you're just using the RNA, that means there's no way for you to get COVID from the vaccine, right?
No.
Yeah.
No, you're not giving whole virus. You're certainly not giving live virus. So you're not able to make viruses. And that's how you get sick with a virus, is they get into your cells and they make whole virus. But we don't put the whole RNA in, so you can't make a whole virus from it. And of course, the other thing that's happened is we've gotten really good at sequencing RNA and DNA. So in January of last year, the Chinese published the RNA sequence. As soon as that got published, Pfizer and Moderna and all these guys were making that in the lab since they had the recipe for it.
Wow.
Do what? Oh, yeah. The thing I'm being reminded is if you're making a bicycle, you've got to have the wheels and the chain and the handlebars and all. And if you're just using handlebars, you can't really make a whole bicycle out of it.
Yeah.
So that's an analogy of just using the spike protein instead of the whole virus. There's still a few whole virus vaccines out there. The polio vaccine is whole virus.
Well, okay. Then that's something. Yeah, if you born before a certain age, we all had the polio vaccine. So yeah. So if someone wanted to participate in a clinical trial, what would they do, and what would the process look like for them? And then what trials are going on now, even?
Well, right now we're in the middle of doing both the Pfizer and the AstraZeneca studies, and currently they've filled enrollment, although it looks like with the new version of Pfizer, we may have some add-in to the version 2.0. They'll want to use some of it in folks who were vaccinated with the original version, but they'll want to try it also in folks who haven't been vaccinated at all to see, does it work well as a booster? Does it work just as well as a standalone? And we're getting ready in June to start the pediatrics trial for the Pfizer vaccine, because of course no kids have data yet, so we don't know what the dose should be for them or how well it works in kids. The process is simple. You contact us and say that you're interested. We've got a website, clinicalresearchassociates.com on the web. And we have posted what we're doing. For instance, we're just now wrapping up a study for a drug for erosive esophagitis, which is kind of like stomach ulcers, but in your esophagus. We've done a bunch of migraine studies over the last year or so. It just depends on whatever the new drug or vaccine is that's being investigated by the FDA. So everything we're doing is ultimately going to end up being looked at by the FDA. So there's oversight at that level. At any rate, back to the question, if somebody's interested, they contact us, they set up an initial visit. The first and most important part is the consenting process. There's usually a pretty large document. It's now generally bigger than 10, 12 pages. Some of them are as much as 40 that lay out all of the details of what's going to happen in the study, how long it takes, how many blood draws, risks and benefits, what we already have learned of potential side effects, both from the animal studies and also phase 1 and 2 studies. And then it also has all the contact information. If a problem comes up, then how to report that in. We will then verbally go through that with a person to make sure that they understand what it is that the study entails and give them a chance to ask any questions they want to ask. And at every step of the way, they can opt out. Anytime they want to, they can say, no, I don't want to do it, and walk out the door. In fact, even once they're in the study, they can say, I don't want to do it, and walk out the door. So in the end, everybody is a total volunteer. There's no leverage I have to try to keep somebody in a study, even if I were inclined to do that, and I'm not. If somebody doesn't want to do it, okay, fine. To me, every time a person says, I don't want to do this anymore, that is actually an endpoint, because they're perceiving more of a negative than a positive benefit. And that to me is a message back to the manufacturer. So, and then from that point, it really depends on what the study is. We'll do an exam and take a medical history. What medications are you taking? It's kind of like at the doctor's office. Some labs or some studies require lab work, blood, urine, whatever. Some really don't do much of that. The one for the erosive esophagitis required endoscopy, where they stick a tube down your throat to see what does it look like. That's about the only time you do a study like that, of course. But then how long it takes depends on what you're trying to find out. All of these COVID studies at this stage of the game are 2 years long. It's not 2 years to determine whether it works or not, or whether it's safe or not, but rather how long does it provide protection? And you can't know until you watch it kind of wear off. If it's still working at 2 years, they'll ask, does anybody want to stick around for a third year and a fourth year, and so on. Took a while to figure out tetanus needs a 10-year booster.
Huh. So you had to be following the patients for 10 years. So we'll have to see like how long are these vaccines effective, and whether there will be a need for a booster. But again, there may be a need to address the variants, the COVID variants out there, right?
It may be a moot point how long it lasts if you have to come up with a new version every year.
Oh, yeah, that's true. And how effective is like the regular flu vaccine?
Well, it varies from year to year. See, the problem with the flu vaccine is we have so many different versions of flu. The vaccines we're using now are called trivalent or quadrivalent because they're active against 3 or 4 different strains of influenza. But that doesn't even come close to covering all the different strains there are. You'll have 2 versions for a type A influenza and 1 or 2 for type B. We don't even make vaccine for type C influenza. And then within the types, there's different strains. So it's a matter of a little bit of a gamble about 6 months out They look at what strains are the most prominent in the southern hemisphere, where it would be winter.
Yeah.
And that's what they choose to make vaccine against.
Oh.
As I pointed out, looking at the election last year, if you looked who was the front runner in the Democratic nomination process in February, that wasn't the person who won the nomination. So you'd have Bernie Sanders or Pete Buttigieg as president now. And that's not the way it turned out. And sometimes that's what happens with the flu vaccine. They pick something that's dominant, and then 6 months later, that's not the dominant strain anymore.
I know.
And yet,
yeah, that's sometimes like, I think that prevents people from getting the flu vaccine. They're like, I took it last year and I got sick anyway. And they're like, okay, what's the use? But I don't think they understand the different strains. And the risk of getting the flu.
yeah.
Yeah.
So there's two parts of the I got the flu anyway.
Yeah.
So whenever you provoke the immune system, its response includes release of chemicals called cytokines. And some cytokines make you have fever or chills or muscle aches or a headache or any of the symptoms you get when you get sick, because that's the virus activating the immune system as compared to the vaccine. The difference is when the vaccine does it, it doesn't tend to last very long, and it doesn't end up being as severe, and you don't get the end organ damage. You're not getting pneumonia from the vaccine, but you sure can get it from influenza.
Yeah.
Even when you've got the wrong strain of pneumonia compared to what you took the vaccine against, you're less likely to land in the hospital or die from influenza. So the really important part still works, even if you do end up getting some other version of influenza. And that's what we've seen with all of these different varieties of COVID vaccine. Some may be more or less effective for keeping you from getting sick at all, but all of them have done a good job keeping people out of the hospital and keeping people from dying from COVID.
Yeah.
So the important stuff still holds.
Yeah, I was just seeing that with the Johnson and Johnson, that when you just compare the efficacy rates, it's less than the Pfizer and Moderna, but when you compare hospitalization, it's the same, and preventing hospitalizations. Yeah. So I mean, I can think of, especially if you're young and healthy, getting onto a trial, and then you may have gotten a vaccine and be protected before other your peers get it. I mean, that could be one advantage of getting onto one of these trials. So what are the rights of someone who participates in a trial? Like you said, it's a voluntary basis, right?
Sure.
So a person can quit anytime, maybe it's just time consuming. They don't, the life circumstances have changed. They're not sure they have the time for it. Is there any payment going on? Do people get paid for anything?
Yeah, they do get paid. It's not generally something you can make a living doing, because it's really meant to compensate for the time and bother, transportation costs, what have you, and then also the pain and suffering from getting blood drawn or whatever. The more onerous, the more you get paid. So, for instance, those guys getting endoscopies get paid more for the endoscopy than anybody gets for a blood draw, for instance. Yeah. And we've had some crazy things. We had a study one time where folks had to stay here for 17 straight days.
Oh, wow.
Now that paid pretty well, but obviously you couldn't be working and doing that at the same time, so it kind of had to pay pretty well.
Yeah. Well,
so it just depends. But I don't think most of the time, in fact, it's considered an ethical issue. If you make it such good remuneration that a person just about can't say no, well, then it's not voluntary anymore either.
Yeah.
So there's another level of oversight called the Institutional Review Board. And their job is to look at a study before it even gets started and the whole time it's going on and say, does it have scientific merit? If not, then you can't do it. And second is it being ethically conducted? Are there sufficient protections for folks? Are you protecting their data, for instance? Yeah. When I started, we didn't have to worry about internet security for our data because it was all on paper. Now, of course, everything's getting uploaded and you have to have sufficient software safety or you're not protecting your patients. Mm-hmm. So that's a moving target as, you know, the world we live in changes. Yeah. But that's still a part of looking after somebody's best interest. And that's that's our most important job, really. Mm-hmm. The data comes second.
So I know with, you know, these vaccines have come out. A lot of question has come about has these vaccines been adequately tested on minority communities? Is it effective? And what would your answer be? And what are you doing with the future trials?
Well, I'd say it's actually rare to find adequate testing in different minority communities because we've had very poor attendance. We've tried best we know how to engage folks from different groups, and we get some folks who come in, but it's not proportionate to the population usually. And there's a lot of historical reasons for this. Obviously, there's some folks who are worried about immigration status being an issue, and you know, am I going to get deported if I do the study? And I certainly understand that. There's cultural issues. We actually had one person in one of our COVID studies, and their family were so upset that they'd gotten a shot of this horrible vaccine that they told him they'd throw him out of the house and he would not be welcome back if he got the second dose. So he had to pull out. Yeah. And of course, how do you argue with something like that? I don't want somebody thrown out of their home. So there's pushback for a lot of different reasons. And, you know, my argument is if you have questions, ask them. I'm happy to answer anybody's questions. Anybody can come and see our site. You'll say this looks a lot like a doctor's office because it's a lot like a doctor's office. And we have all the same expectations for looking after the welfare of people. I guess there's plenty of folks out there who don't trust their doctors either. And I don't know what to say to them. But yeah, it's my job to worry about how you turn out and how well you do.
So I mean, why is it important in the first place to make sure that minorities are represented in clinical trials?
Well, everybody's the same and everybody's different at the same time. Mm-hmm. You know, you might be allergic to one drug and I'm not allergic to it, but what I'm allergic to doesn't bother you a bit. Mm-hmm. How are you going to know whether that's a trend in one group or another? There's a class of drugs for blood pressure called ACE inhibitors. Mm-hmm. They're very widely used. They're all generic now. There's about 10 of them. Black patients are more likely to have an allergic reaction to those drugs than white patients. There's only one way we found that out was by having Black patients study them just like white patients. Mm. When the statin drugs for cholesterol were being investigated, and that was, you know, back in the 80s and 90s mostly, they seemed to work great, but the populations being studied were overwhelmingly white European descent. One of the drug companies, as their way of working it up, did separate studies in different ethnic groups. So they had a study in Black Americans and study in Hispanic Americans. When they got to the Asian Americans, and these were more the Eastern Asian, mm-hmm. They found an interesting thing. They had a much, much higher rate of side effects. Oh. And when they measured the blood levels of the drug, they found out that that population broke the drug down at about half the rate of all the other ethnic groups. So they were running twice the blood level. Mm-hmm. And the upshot was, well, cut the dose in half for this group of patients and you'll get good results and you won't get the side effects. Well, how else do you know that unless you look at the drug behavior in that group of people?
Wow. Wow. We, didn't think about how there could be such difference in reaction or, effects of a medicine on a person based on maybe their ethnic background or, and I know environment plays a part in it also. And so I think it's important that we get representation. But again, it's those barriers. It's what people's relationship with the medical community, their historical relationship that they have to overcome. But I mean, this is great work that's being done, and we are so grateful that there is a vaccine. I mean, there are vaccine choices out there, and somebody had to go through the trial for us to have these vaccines now, for us to feel a glimmer of hope that maybe by the summer things will be a little bit better. I don't know.
And that was the answer. That was the answer to your original question. Why should you do a trial? So we'll have new drugs and new vaccines, because if nobody does it, we never get anything new.
Exactly.
It's a way that you can help your friends and neighbors and family and the world at large, really.
Right. You're absolutely right. Before we close, there was one more question. I know you briefly touched on it. Is what about the children? Because we're talking about vaccinations, and I guess 16 and up for Pfizer or 18 and up for the Pfizer Moderna. When will we have something for the kids?
Well, the study at our site is supposed to start in June. There may be other studies that have already started that I just don't know about. But yeah, the original Pfizer study expanded along the way and ultimately grew to include 16-year-olds and up.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to be looking at 5 to 16, and they're already asking us, would we be interested in doing folks, I think 6 months to 5 years old. So they're going to, they did tend to do it in groupings like that or in age ranges. I've never done a study where it was infant to 80. But well, part of that is you're going to dose differently in most cases.
Right. It's going to be very
different. So, oh yeah. But I think from what I'm hearing from Fauci and the CDC crowd, I don't think that they're going to demand quite as long a study in kids, since these vaccines have already cleared the hurdles of at least initially showing safety and efficacy. So I don't think they're going to have to be that terribly long just to show, okay, we're getting a similar kind of response in kids. We're not seeing a real difference in side effects. So it looks good to go in them. So I imagine that the kids will be getting dosed within a few months, or it'll get emergency use authorization within a few months after getting the kid studies going, whereas it took, several months after getting the adult studies going. It's more of a known commodity.
Yeah, that was a question they had, emergency use authorization. So Johnson & Johnson is applying for that. And that's right. How Moderna and Pfizer, is that safe, or is it just almost as good as getting full approval? Or
well, yeah, the difference is with vaccines, and of course different rules apply to different things, but with vaccines you have to have at least the 2-month safety data. They usually want 6-month safety data for approval.
Oh, okay.
And approval means it can go on the market, officially, to be sold from drugstores or whatever. But you don't really see the emergency use authorization very much. The only reason is because we're in a pandemic. What are you going to do? Yeah. Now that you've got some evidence that it works, let's start stopping this thing. Mm-hmm. The other places where you might have heard about it was, you have somebody with some weird rare cancer, and they're going to die if you don't try an experimental drug on them. And this person isn't in the study, but you're not going to treat them. What are you going to do? Yeah. And so That's usually been on more of a case-by-case basis from the FDA. This is the first time I've seen it in such widespread use.
Yeah, well, it's a unique circumstances, hopefully not to be repeated again, pandemics, but I guess history tells us it will be repeated somehow. But it just seemed like
Oh, yeah.
with the vaccines coming out so quickly, that maybe we were in a better position to, protect our community. But 500,000 dead is still, I just find it
Yeah.
unacceptable. Unacceptable. So, may God have mercy on all those souls who passed away and on their families. But I think it's important work to, these vaccine trials, and to be a part of it, and part of history making, part of being a part of the solution, for not just our families and our communities, but for the nation, for the world. Because those are heroes too. So any last words? I mean, I really enjoyed this conversation. Anything else people should know?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head, except I'm certainly thankful for the folks who have volunteered and participated in these studies, because they've helped us to get some very promising looking vaccines that are going to help all of us at the end of the day. And we wouldn't have been able to do it just from my staff here and me. It's because we've had the volunteers that has made it possible for us to get these vaccines for everybody. So my gratitude goes to them.
Thank you. Well, what is your website? Clinical
Research Associates.
Okay.
www.clinicalresearchassociates.com.
Okay.
We're at the corner of 15th and Church, right down here in the medical center of Nashville. If you want to check us out, come check us out. I'll be happy to, visit with anybody and explain anything that folks want to do. I mean, we've been here for quite a long time, and basically nobody's noticed for a long time until we got all this press coverage because of the pandemic.
Yeah. Well,
but since I've been here, I've run like 600 different drug studies, so it's been pretty busy.
And if anyone has any follow-up questions for you, how can they contact you?
Well, we have a phone number is 615-329-2222, and we'll be happy to answer questions that anybody has.
Okay.
I think the best way to reach people is to answer their questions, because then you're directly addressing concern.
Okay. Well, we're live on Facebook. We'll make sure we'll put that in the put your website in the chat, so people know how to contact you. But I really appreciate the work you're doing. Thank you so much.
Sure. My pleasure.
Okay. Good night.
Night. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.